Good afternoon. I would like to thank Armando and Daberta Bernardini for their huge work to make this happen, and I'm very happy to share with you the results of a collective reflection that is part of this book that I co-authored with my colleague and friend, Jocelyne Cesari, and it was the outcome of several years of research on women's rights in Catholic and Muslim countries to evaluate the role of religion on the status of women's rights today. It ended up to be more heavily based on the status of Muslim women in different countries, but we have a couple of chapters on French laïcité and also some reflection on the role of Catholicism in Latin America, on the democratization process and what it meant for women. So before I give you a little more in depth on some of the results or takeaway, I would like just to take a step back and take it actually from the debate that unfortunately I missed part of it this morning, but I heard this afternoon. And when you look at women and rights and Islam, you usually face two threads of scholarship that do not talk to each other. One is about Islamic feminism, and there is a huge amount of work, and we had very prominent voices about that. Most of it is to say that actually Islam came in an environment that was hostile to women, and that the Islamic message was a progress toward equality and recognition of women. And then you have a whole theological, textual work done to make this message and the scripture still relevant to the challenges of women today. The other thread of scholarship is about Islam and democracy. And interestingly, this scholarship doesn't talk to the other one and vice versa. And why is it important? Because most of my colleagues, I have the bilingual, so to speak, disciplinary track. I do religious studies and political science, but it's not so easy to do. And when you talk to political science, they will spend a lot of time explaining to you that Islam may be an impediment to the democratization of Muslim majority country. And look, it translates into the fact that most of Muslim majority countries are actually behind when it comes to democracy. So why is it? Is it because of Islam? So you have these two scholarships. And in this project, it was a team project because we cannot work on this topic only from a very individual point of view. It has to be a teamwork in order to be able to compare and put things into perspective. And I'm very happy that we have here discussion not only on Islam but also on Catholicism and Judaism, because what I'm going to say may also echo with what you have heard so far. So what does this mean concretely? And I just want to say it right there. The debate we are having now is contextualized in a particular situation, which is the nation state. And here I'm not talking about state policy. I'm talking about nation. And there is a wonderful scholarship done on the changes brought by the national framework to politics, to mental illness, to culture. Interestingly, there is a blind spot called religion. And what we see is that our psyche has been completely changed, and we take for granted a lot of terms that we apply retrospectively in times and areas where there was no nation state. And this is a premise on which most of my presentation will build. So I could provide you more proof or data to that, but that's not the point here. So the starting point, if I know how to manage that, yes. So there is a change that was brought in Muslim majority countries as we know them, that date back to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the rise of nation state. And why is it important? Because we take for granted the natural, obvious aspect of nation. It has never been obvious, even in Europe, actually. And what happened in most of Muslim majority countries, and in some other countries as well, is that the state was a major agent in changing the collective identities, the narrative, including the gender narrative. And if we do not take this into account, we cannot understand the majority of challenges that women are facing in most of this context. So in my work, and it's probably most counterintuitive to what you have heard so far, but I will keep my ground here. When we talk about political Islam, we usually talk about Islamic parties or Islamist movement. What I have done in my work in the last 4 or 5 years is to show that political Islam starts with the building of the nation state, even in the case of very secular countries. Because what happened at the time of the building of the nation state is that for the first time, there was a connection between Islamic belonging and national belonging that didn't exist in the pre-modern empire phase. Unlike what people think, because unfortunately there is the ISIS nightmare or discourse on the caliphate, the historical caliphate was a multicultural, multilinguistic, multi-religious political entity that you cannot call a state. And here we have to be clear, there is no nation state before the building of nation state in Europe, and then the expansion across the world with colonialism, imperialism, trade, and so on, to the point that today, if you want to exist internationally, you have to be a state. Hence, ISIS, whatever they call this, it's not a caliphate in the traditional sense of the term. So what is triggering here the reflection on women's rights, but also on the Islamic tradition, is to go back to the debates that happened at the end of the Ottoman Empire, when there is an encounter with the West that is cultural, that is scientific, academic, but is also political. And you have two major threads that until now influence the condition of women. One is the pan-Islamist movement that never died, which is we're going to rebuild a political community based on the Islamic link, which didn't exist before until this moment in the 19th century. Ummah doesn't mean the community of Muslim believers. It means the totality of territories under the rule of the caliph. So if I am a Greek Orthodox in Istanbul, I am part of the Ummah. Does it mean that it's all pinky and rosy for everybody? Obviously not. But you have status of different religious groups. And again, you cannot say this is secular, because at the time, nobody is secular. We have to look at how was Europe under Christian rules, and what's happening at the time in Muslim empire. So there is recognition of plurality, intra-plurality, but also inter-plurality. And this is important to keep in mind, because at the time, the ulema do not operate under the control of the caliph. There is no such a thing. So the ulema are in charge of local communities, and they develop rules and procedure to take care of what's called in Arabic maslaha. But the maslaha is not the maslaha of the caliph in Istanbul or Baghdad. It's how do I deal with this local community to provide rules that make sense every day. And this community is religiously diverse. There are wonderful work that has been done on Morocco, for example, looking at the dialogue between Sharia court and rabbinical courts on issues indeed like women's rights, marriage and divorce. And this was not done because Istanbul said so. This was this independence that was intellectual, religious, financial and structural. To make a long story short, this independence will disappear with the building of the nation state. Everywhere, in all the territories that became nation and that used to be portion of the Muslim empire. You see emerging a central power. The definition of a portion of territory in a very authoritarian way. That's why most of the countries that became nation state did that under authoritarian rule. And it was, the nation was first thought by the elite and then implemented in different policies. Again, think of Turkey. Turkey is a case in point. There is no Turkey until 1924. People thought of themselves as part of local community with different kind of interactions. And then 1924, Traité de Sèvres, this is it. This is a portion of territory that we call Turkey. People will speak Turkish. They will obey to a central power. What is never said, and that's why when I hear Turkey secular, I have my doubt, is that the Kemal Atatürk will nationalize the major dominant school, the Hanafi school, and make it a part of the state system. Meaning, it nationalize the endowments, so it take all the wealth, it turns the cleric into civil servants, and it controls what they teach and what they learn about the Islamic tradition. That's what I call the beginning of political Islam. If we were talking this way for any other country, in Europe, in Africa, we would say this is a politicization of religion. And indeed it is. This is a moment where citizens start to think of themselves as Turkish and Muslim. Again, it doesn't mean that all the prescription of Islam will apply. Actually, Kemal Atatürk will do what no other secular rulers did, which is to push as much as possible the presence of Islam into the social interaction. He will be the only one that will not use Islamic references to build a civil law. But short than that, if you talk today to Turks, they have a lot of time to acknowledge the diversity, religious diversity. I remember going on a trip with one of my friends, Jewish, and she comes from Salonika. So she went there, we had discussion with Turks, and they were saying, you are from Turkey, but you are Jewish. How is it possible? This is what the nation state does to narrative and collective identity. It doesn't mean that the people are practitioners in a very strict way. And that's why here we have to be very clear that religion is not only belief. I would say that 90% of the thing I'm going to say has nothing to do with the belief. It has to do with the belonging and the behaving. And most of the fight today on women's rights are about the belonging and the behaving, not the believing. Even ISIS, I've never heard any theological discussion on the side of ISIS on the nature of the message or the status of the prophet. That's not what is at stake. But who do I belong to and how do I behave? And these are two dimensions, unfortunately, that we tend to understudy when we do religion and rights. And I will try to show you that it is maybe a way to bring together the two scholarships I was mentioning initially. So this building of the nation state by creating an homogeneous community, and again, to finish on the case of Turkey, that's why Alevi don't have any legal status. That's why Kurds, that's why Kurds do not have recognition. This is what the nationalization process does. It is an homogenization process. Again, nothing specific here. That's what nations do everywhere. I mean, with more or less efficiency in terms of eradicating differences, but it's there. So when it comes to Islam, the untold part of the story, again, because of this breakdown on different disciplines, is that the state also was a major agent in legitimizing certain interpretation of Islam that would fit the framework of the nation state. You have a reflection that starts, as I said, before the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, on what is a legitimate political community, what is the role of Islam in it, etc. And you have also the rise under colonial rule of major changes in the decision-making within Islam. The major changes is about the concept of Sharia. Today, it's a given, at least in the common parlance, that we're talking about Islamic law. Sharia is not Islamic law, it's like halacha, it's a way, it's a methodology. It's not written in the tradition. It's a monopoly of scholars of religion that can provide grounded response to questions. The moment you put this, the results of this continuous process into writing and make it a book, then you have an Islamic law under the purview of the state. And this will change the relationship of religious actors, but also believers vis-à-vis the state, in the sense that there is taken for granted among the secular and the religiously based actor that if you want to push Islam or to maintain Islam, you have to take on the state. This is a modern thinking. There is no such a thing in the Islamic tradition than to take the power at the state level to implement, again, the maslaha or the revelation-based community, because after all, the message of Islam is about that. How do I manage and extend and make thrive a revelation-based community, which is the message of all the monotheistic revelations here. So there was no desire. The maslaha before the nation state is about the status of local communities. With the nation state, the maslaha is transferred to the legitimacy of the state and the state institution. So it will change completely the discourse on Islam. And most of the transmission of Islam in Islamic universities that are state universities controlled by the state have shown these changes, to the point that some scholars are even wondering where are the places now where the Islamic tradition in all its complexity, richness, and thought-provoking way is taught. I can tell you that in 90% of the case, it's not in Islamic universities in Muslim-majority countries. So we have a problem here, because this does affect directly the condition of thinking in context with the tradition on what are Muslims' women's rights. So, the condition of most Muslim-majority countries is what I call hegemonic Islam. So what does this mean? As I said, it's based everywhere, so the confusion and acceptation that the secular share with the Islamist, which I am a Muslim and I am a citizen of this country, and this defines my nationality. And this is also true for the minorities, by the way. There is a very striking declaration made by a Copt in Egypt saying, I am Copt by religion and Muslim by nationality and citizenship. That's exactly what I'm trying to say here. So in most of these countries, all the Islamic institutions, personnel, wealth, have been nationalized, meaning it's not that the state controls, it's part of the state system. And if this, we have not paid attention enough to the changes brought to the Islamic thinking that, in my opinion, explain also the extreme politicization and radicalization in groups like ISIS. We have not paid enough attention, thinking that Islamic parties came out of, a reaction against so-called very secular regime. It's yes and no. The secular regime never let go of Islam, ever. The second is that in these countries, the exception being Turkey here, is the state has maintained some Islamic prescription in the civil law. And most of these prescriptions have to do with, no surprise here, family law, which directly concern women in their sexuality, in their family life. And this is also the reason why the women have become so central also in political debate about the status of religion in society and public life, because the state has taken on to define a certain kind of orthodoxy that is based on a reinterpretation within a secular frame of some Islamic prescription. And of course, it evolves. There has been a fantastic discussion in Egypt about, the divorce initiated by women, and the changes brought by claims of women that this has to be more recognized in the Sharia courts. We talked about Morocco and the change in the family code that is now one of the most egalitarian, with lots of pitfalls here and there. But it was done under the purview of the state, with a body of ulema working on the Maliki tradition. So you see here what I'm trying to say about a state is a sort of orthodoxy of Islam sanctioned by the state. And this is not disappearing. Even if you have global movement, all the people involved in global movement have been socialized in this context. That's why nobody questions Islamic belonging and political belonging. And this is an issue. What ISIS did is just to globalize this. But it's this is the cornerstone of most of Muslim majority societies, and the role of women is central in there, because we talk about patronizing women. Most of Muslim majority countries, when they were established, actually promoted women's rights. That's in terms of education, in health, political rights. There was an advancement in all these domains. I want to show you a few slides that talk better than I do. For example, this is a slide on the political representation. Unlike what people think, some Muslim countries are more significantly advanced than some Western countries. Maybe you can you see that, or is it too small? Yeah. Yeah. Second one, economic participation. This is also an interesting one, where you see that there is a fight in democracies about equality of rights, but in some countries these rights have been granted by the secular state, at the same time maintaining the role of women as central in the family based on religion. And this is this dichotomy or discrepancy that in the West we have hard time to understand, because our story has been a continuous step forward from patriarchy to economy to marriage, while in most of other countries, not only Muslim countries, this is not a whole package. Some rights have advanced, that's what I call individual rights, and this is again wage equality. Look at the wage equality between some Western and some Muslim countries. Yeah. So what are we talking about when we talk about women's rights? We are talking about a difference between these individual rights versus what I call in my work the rights of the self. So these individual rights have more or less advanced. That's why taking Saudi Arabia as a sort of poster child for the situation of women's rights in Muslim country is more than wrong. It's politically damaged. It damaged the whole discourse about women, Islam, and rights. Because this is a reality, where sometimes, I finished here, sometimes the situation of Muslim in terms of Muslim women in terms of rights is more advanced than in some Western countries. But at the same time, you have still struggle about the family and the equality between husband and wife in the family, the share of responsibilities, the custody of children, the law of inheritance, and this has not moved so much. And that's why also Islamists are taking position. If you look at most of Islamist parties today, I'm not talking about the Salafi, because they are sort of globalization of the Wahhabi thinking, but most of Islamists would agree with that. But they would say we need to preserve the family cell and maintain traditional, religiously distinct role for men and women. And women within this movement are also pushing back, which remind me the discussion I heard about Judaism. You know, that's. Except that here it's a state-sanctioned orthodoxy, which is, I think, part of the problem. Okay, let me finish here. So Yes, so what I'm trying to say here is that how do we reconnect an interpretation of Islam based on a strict methodology that does exist in the Islamic tradition, that is not used anymore, even by clerics that proclaim themselves as representative of the establishment? And how do we make this discussion understandable by women in different contexts? And this is a challenge that is not an academic challenge. It is a political challenge. And it is related to the capacity of Muslim scholars, not only women. What bothers me a lot sometimes on any kind of feminist discourse is that the women are talking about the women. What kind of work can be done to involve also the scholars who are male and that can participate in this discussion without the male being threatened by this? This is a key problem. I think that we are not paying attention enough. And you can see that this can emerge. Again, Morocco is a very interesting case where the Mudawana was actually sanctioned by the body of Maliki clerics. And then you had people on the ground fighting, because indeed for people, we are talking about culture and religious rights. There is a patriarchal culture where it sounds threatening that suddenly the women get so much freedom in the marriage. So you had work done by Muslim scholars, including the ulema, to show that it was right, that it was not against Islam to apply locally the Mudawana. This is the kind of work that has to be done. And unfortunately, what happened most of the time, we get a very polarized debate, secular versus Islamic. What I'm trying to tell you here is that actually it is not as simple as that. We have to look at what is at stake in the women's rights discourse that implies the belonging and the behaving, not only of my person, but of my religion, of my revelation-based community. And some women who go from very orthodox position, they do not think only in terms of individual rights. They think also of the future of this particular community. And this is a tragedy of postmodern time where, you know, how do you balance the survival or resistance of the community, and in this case, a revelation-based community, which is not secularly thinkable, so to speak, and the right of people to be empowered within this community. And again, for me, this challenge is, I give you an example, but I think it's a challenge that is now happening across religious tradition. And so I'm advocating here for a more complex approach to secularism and to religion, and trying to bring them together to look at women's rights and Islam. Thank you.